Okay. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's event. We are here joined by Julie Torrant, who will be presenting today. Julie has written The Material Family, a book published by Springer, has published essays in journals such as Science, 19th Century Prose, and Textual Practice, and is writing a new book on the dialectical body, materialist critique of disability and contemporary cultural critique. She has taught at various campuses of the City University of New York and the State University of New York. She's a co-editor of The Red Critique, and today's presentation is based on Julie's chapter in a forthcoming edited book and collection of essays, which will be published by Routledge, and it's titled Marxism and the Pandemic, the Materialist Anatomy of a Social Crisis, and the book is edited by Stephen Tumino. So, Julie, would you like to start now?
Okay, sure. So the title, the working title of the chapter is Pandemic, Disability, and Capitalism. There are some slides that I'm going to skip over for the sake of the presentation, and there's a couple of points that I will add, but let me see, and I'm going to check my time. All right. So pandemic, disability, and capitalism. Making pandemic intelligible, the medical, political, and social dialectical. Making pandemic intelligible, the dominant frame, I claim, of the pandemic is an ontological approach that makes pandemic into a self-enclosed thing in itself. In contrast, Marxist theory explains the ontology of pandemic as socially produced and enables grasping connections not only among effects, but to their cause. Just noticing I need to change my, I may have some tech help here. I need to change this because I'm cutting off the edge of it for me to see. Hey, Rob, just one moment.
You just want to move the pictures.
Oh, how do I do that? Okay.
Grab the top bar.
Okay, got it. Okay. The vast majority of writings on the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 pandemic, as in itself, is descriptive and thus isolates the pandemic's various effects from one another and, crucially, their cause. This does not mean that they do not refer to different effects of the pandemic and perhaps even some of their relations to one another. But, in their logic or underpinnings, theoretical, they block understanding pandemic as a contradictory totality determined, if in highly mediated ways, by the capitalist mode of production. And I go on, I'm going to skip over the medical frame because I think you all grasp that. I use the CDC as an example. Theories of pandemic are theories of the relation between the natural and the social. The medical absolute, it corresponds to the medical model of disability, as you will not be surprised. Absolute, the medical absolute delinks the natural disease from the social and thus implicitly uses the pandemic to indicate that the natural always overtakes the social, and history is a series of aleatory events. Disability and the political theory of pandemic. Disability has become relevant because it represents a critique of the dominant medical theory for ignoring the differential effects of the pandemic and thereby reproducing the relations of domination in society. Dominant disability theory represents pandemic as political, not simply natural. My argument regarding the dominant political theory. The politicization of pandemic is limited and ultimately puts forward a more or less thick description of the pandemic and its relation to disability because the roots of the pandemic as well as disability are social, economic, not simply political. These theories, in other words, sever domination, oppression from its roots in exploitation. I have a few examples of the political theory and its negation of the medical absolute. There are many others in there, and I'll discuss, obviously more of them in my chapter. In their introduction to Disability Studies Quarterlies, Special issue on disability and COVID-19. The editors cite the reason or context for deciding to produce the special issue as, quote, being acutely aware of the structural disadvantages disabled people face and how existing disadvantages were exacerbated and new ones emerged. Another example from the special issue of International Journal of Critical Diversity Studies, Shelley Tremaine argues that, quote, mainstream philosophical discourses about the pandemic has largely ignored the systemic poverty, isolation, and social disadvantages and inequities that have increasingly accrued to disabled people due to the pandemic, unquote. Unlike the CDC's medical frame, the CDC is the example I give in that medical frame. The editors of DSQ, Special Issue, and Tremaine argue not only that the effects of COVID-19 on disabled people are disproportionate, but that this inequity is due to systemic inequities such as poverty, isolation, and social disadvantages. My critique of the political theory of pandemic. As these examples mark, disability theory has been a central thread of the political theory of the pandemic, along with, and sometimes overlapping with, theories of the, quote, social determinants of health and feminist and anti-racist theories. While they move beyond the individualist approach of the medical frame put forward, for instance, by the CDC, and thus negate the one-sided medical approach, they are themselves limited and undialectical because they delink politics from economics and specifically the social relations of production. That they are undialectical is marked by taking as a starting point, or a given, I should add, the existence of, quote, disabled at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, hence their ontological approach. Specifically, they either completely erase the capitalist social relations of production, or if they cite the capitalist social relations of production, they produce at the level of theory a flat ontology wherein these wage-labor capital relations are not determinate. This is what is at stake when Bloch et al. And Tremaine conceptualize disability as a Weberian matter of disadvantages and inequities in terms of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Excuse me. The limits of these theories, I argue, are not simply produced by the newness of the pandemic situation of COVID-19, as some of these theories suggest. The political theories of pandemic and disability and their limits are genealogically related to and informed by the dominant analytics of disability that distinguishes impairment, the natural, from disability, the social, as articulated by the British social model of disability and other liberal disability theories. Their limits are symptomatic of the limits of this analytics. And we'll definitely talk about this in the question and answer, as one of the issues here is how we read the social model of disability. I know that, for instance, in the text of Finkelstein's that we read in the reading group, I think it was 2 months ago, he actually does use the social relations of production as root cause, but he kind of oscillates between that understanding and this political understanding, and so presents an eclectic response. So there's that issue within that tradition, and then there's the issue also of how it has been taken up. So, we can obviously get into that. Despite its stated aims and name, the British social model is a political theory of disability. Again, as we'll talk about this some more. The British social model, as you know, has been criticized repeatedly for the way it brackets impairment, putting it in an analytical black box. What has been given much less attention is the limits of its understanding of its central concept, the social. In UPIAS's fundamental principles, they, on the one hand, do not explicitly theorize what they mean by the social. On the other, implicit in their argument about what they themselves argue is the crucial question of the root cause of disability, they posit the social as limited to capitalist institutions. UPIAS writes, from this social point of view, it follows that the impoverishment of physically impaired people arises out of the fact that, as a group, we are excluded from the mainstream of social activities. In the final analysis, the particular form of poverty principally associated with physical impairment is caused by our exclusion from the ability to earn an income on par with, that should say their able-bodied peers, due to the way employment is organized. This exclusion from the ability to earn an equal income to able-bodied peers, earn an equal income to able-bodied peers or workers is linked to our exclusion from participating in the social activities and provision that makes general employment possible. For example, physically impaired school children are characteristically excluded from normal education preparatory work. We are unable to achieve the same flexibility in using transportation and find suitable housing so as to live conveniently to our possible employment, and so on. UPIAS, focuses on what are effects of the capitalist social relations of production and the profit motive embedded within these relations without identifying, much less discussing here, these relations as the root cause of these institutional effects or practices or experience effects. They want to end the exclusion of physically disabled people, but without understanding why they are excluded in the first place. Limiting the social to the political is symptomatic of the British social model's withinist or arrestic dialectic. From this perspective, there is no outside to capitalist institution and their effects, and not only is impairment posited as a natural given, but nature is also fixed or dehistoricized. From this liberal perspective, as Martha Russell and Roddy Slork have argued, and again, this is an issue we'll come back to in discussion, disability and impairment are ultimately rooted in discriminatory attitudes. Descriptivism and the question of class versus status. It is important to add that such descriptivism, which presents itself as explanation, is not simply lacking. Such more or less thick description is rooted in prioritizing the matter of reproduction or matters of reproduction consumption, in other words, the market over production. Doing so displaces class difference with differences within the working class or status, and offers a subjectivity to disabled workers that posits their individual and group interests as opposing that of other groups and individuals. Dominant political theories of pandemic, disability, impairment, etc., are symptomatic of the dominant contemporary left and its theory. And by theory, I mean despite its variations, French, Italian, German, US. Obviously, this will be a larger discussion in my chapter. On the basis of the idea that post-long boom, and especially marked by the boundary of pre-revolutionary struggles of '68 as a before and after, Badiou's work is an example here, there have been such significant changes in the social relations of production that the dominant left argues new theory is needed. Primary among these new theories at the site of disability after the British social model, as I argue in my abstract, are bourgeois theories in which impairment and disability are undone as a binary opposition, and the two become one instance of what Bruno Latour calls the proliferation of hybrids. A key moment in the emergence of such theories is represented by Tom Shakespeare and Nicholas Watson's The Social Model of Disability, an Outdated Ideology. I critique this text as well as newer ontological theories of disability in the essay this presentation is drawn from. I just want to say a couple of things, and again, this is something we could come back to. Shakespeare and Watson, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with their work, argue that the distinction between impairment and disability in the British social model is a, quote, rigid dichotomy. And they question it through an epistemological framework, a Nietzschean, I would say, epistemological framework. They write, for instance, where does impairment begin and disability start? And then through that line of questioning, the epistemological questioning, they end up concluding that, this is a quote that's not on here, an embodied ontology would argue, they argue for an embodied ontology and would argue that there is no qualitative difference between disabled people and non-disabled people because we are all impaired. And then conclude that this claim that everyone is impaired is far-reaching and important, is a far-reaching and important insight into human experience. So they circle all the way back around to human experience as a whole, dropping out their own question of difference. Other examples that I critique in the chapter include actor network theory and some new materialist theories. An example of actor network theory I can tell you if you want in the discussion. One of the assumptions of many of the new theories, as you know, is that the law of value is defunct. The global and many of them conclude, like Negri, for instance, and many others, that it is in fact defunct. I argue the global economic crisis of 2008 and the global crisis set off by the pandemic in 2020 both show that, contrary to the left's argument that with the emergence of immaterial labor or the dominance of finance capital or cognitive capital, the law of value is an outdated ideology. Labor at the point of production remains the only source of new value, and this is why capitalism is in such deep crisis. There have been significant changes in capitalist social relations of production. However, these changes are not, as the new theories argue or imply, changes in the fundamental labor relations of capitalism, the class relations of exploitation of wage labor by capital. I argue in contrast to the political theory or theories of pandemic and disability for an explanatory social economic theory of pandemics in general and the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. Marxist, historical, dialectical, materialist concepts are indispensable resources for developing such an explanatory theory. Developing such a theory is important for disability studies in part because the COVID-19 pandemic is an important and exemplary site to not only theorize why disability is historical and rooted in capitalist social relations of production and its drive for profits, but to also should say understand why impairment is historical and rooted in capitalist social relations of production. The latter is perhaps especially important for advancing disability theory. So the social theory of pandemic. Pandemic is, quote, a dialectical process of the relation of the social and the natural determined by the mode of production. The COVID-19 pandemic is a product of and thus shaped by contemporary capitalism, which is to say that the relation between nature and the social that produces pandemics now is exemplary of the contradiction between the productive forces as they have been developed within capitalism and the capitalist relations of production, and more specifically, is a mark of the way the class contradictory social relations of production, that is, capitalist private property relations, fetters what is possible based on the development of the forces of production. Pandemic is not an event. In other words, contrary to the implications of dominant descriptive narratives about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic is not a contingent and thus ultimately unknowable and unpredictable, quote, event. and the scientific and material resources needed to prevent the emergence and spread of such diseases as COVID-19 exist. However, COVID-19 and other such pandemics, for example, the avian flu, may become a pandemic. If it doesn't, another such illness will emerge and become pandemic in one form or another. The form of such pandemics is accidental, are necessarily produced within capitalism. Specific pandemics are produced by what Engels calls, quote, the dialectic of accident and necessity. The necessity is, again, inherent in capitalism and its private property relations. In other words, the drive for profits, which is endemic to capitalism and which leads to its increasing encroachment on the natural environment in which viruses are rife. The never-ending debate between the lab leak theory and the theory of zoonotic leap, beginning at the Wuhan market, is a distraction. Capital is only too happy to keep going in order to block the crucial question of why illnesses that are the result of zoonotic transmission are not only produced, but are being produced at a faster rate. There was, by the way, an opinion piece in the New York Times yesterday floating the lab leak theory with some 1,200 something comments almost immediately on that article. The answer to this question is that the relationship between humans and nature is determined by the exploitative labor relations of capitalism alongside capitalism's competitive drive for ever increasing profits. Zoonotic diseases today are produced because of the increased interaction and proximity between humans and animals due to deforestation, climate change, often illegal markets or exchange in wildlife at markets such as Wuhan. See, for instance, This Week in Virology, I just thought I would mention that is, I have found that to be a useful podcast to listen to. And they've covered that topic several times, so I haven't given a specific episode. And the logic of these proximal causes, in other words, the climate deforestation, climate change, markets, and exchange in wildlife, the logic of these proximal causes is the drive for profits. The impaired body in the British social model, and particularly what we might discuss is the British social model itself divided into, at least if you take the totality of it, so we're maybe talking about one thread of the British disability model, and maybe in my chapter, I'm gonna wanna distinguish that and develop the economic social thread, and that would, I think, potentially be quite useful. The impaired body of the British social model, but at least in the one thread of it that I critique here, is posited as an Aristotelian substrate. It is thus naturalized and dehistoricized. In contrast, from a historical materialist perspective, disability and capitalism refers to the exclusion from exploitation, this is a quote, exclusion from exploitation as wage laborers of those workers whose, quote, non-standard bodies and or minds negatively or potentially negatively impact the ability of capitalists to produce and accumulate surplus value profits, which is the base of profits. And that's from Russell, page 2. You'll notice there are some typos because I do a lot of dictating that are dictate typos. To be a, quote, impaired person, in other words, is to have a, quote, non-standard body and or mind that situates the person as potentially excluded or marginalized because it does not have the same capacity as a standard body to produce surplus value for the capitalist class. Disablement is the process of exclusion or marginalization, particularly within the social relations of production, the social division of labor of the impaired. An impairment is not simply a difference in the body and or minds or body minds of a person or group of persons which can be valued differently, that is affirmed. Rather, it is a difference that marks individuals and groups in specific ways within a particular mode of production and specifically within the capital wage labor relations and its social divisions of labor. Impairment is thus historical and social, with the social as determined by the social relations of production on at least two levels. The rate of exploitation is the ratio of surplus to necessary labor, which increases as the productivity of labor increases, primarily as a result in capitalism of the competition-driven development of the labor-saving forces of production, with the consequent tendency of the profit rate to fall, and the need to counteract this downward pressure through increased exploitation of those workers capital is still able to employ, because of course it's producing a relative surplus population as well. Thus, whether the rate of exploitation increases due to increased work hours and workload, as we of course see increasing, this is the note here, of course, the increasing workloads in the public sphere of reproductive labor where exploitation in the capitalist sense does not take place, because from the point of view of the capitalist class, such labor is a drain on profits and or the availability of labor for exploitation. So thus, whether the rate of exploitation increases due to increased work hours and workload, or due to an increased rate of exploitation, impairments, body minds that are not able to fit into the existing division of labor and produce in ways that meet capital's need for accumulation of wealth are produced, and increasingly so, because workers are subject to deteriorating working and living conditions. This approach to disability, and impairment and their relation enables us to explain the experiences of not only the already disabled workers of the, I say 2019, that should say 2020, but the production of enormous new groups of impaired workers across the globe. There would be no COVID-19 pandemic without the drive for profits and the commodification and alienation of labor power it necessitates and requires. The COVID-19 pandemic is not an autonomous natural event. An impairment is not the production of merely bodily difference, but the production of the non-standard body in relation to the standard determined by the needs of capital. Pandemics such as COVID-19 will continue to be produced until the social relations that necessitate their production are transformed. In other words, until the end of the domination of capitalist private property relations, which privileges wealth accumulation over the lives of humans, as well as a sustainable natural environment. Capital's drive for profits and the crises it is producing is not, as is posited in political theory, a matter of bad values or ethics, that is greed, but rather an effect of the laws of motion of capital and the resulting crisis of profitability that developed after the post-war boom of the 20th century in the advanced capitalist countries, and both manifested and deepened in turn with the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2020. It is crucial to emphasize that there is, however, a historical outside to the capitalist social relations of production and thus to their myriad and increasingly negative effects, including preventable pandemics such as COVID-19. That outside is the existing forces, productive forces, and what they make possible. In the following slides, I just delineated the understanding of productive forces that I'm working with. And what is to be done? The Marxism and Disability Network, I argue, is uniquely positioned to contribute to the development of Marxist theory of disability and impairment, or disability in relation to impairment, in order to contribute producing the revolutionary theory necessary to develop workers' class consciousness of the necessity and possibility of social transformation. Okay.
Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you.
Would it be possible for you to stop the sharing of the
Oh,
slides?
yes,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Okay, great.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your chapter with us all. I would like us to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back at say 12 past and start the Q&A then.
Thank you.
So thank you, Julie. Welcome everyone back to the Q&A session. I would like you to raise your hands so we can see who's got questions. If that is not a good option, then please also write in the chat. I will. How would you like, Julie? How would you like us to take the questions? Would you like to address one at a time, or take them in bulk? Or I cannot hear you.
Maybe start with 2, and then we could go 1 and 1.
2. Okay. I don't think I can raise. Yeah, that's fine. I cannot raise my hand, but I'll ask a question later on. Okay, so shall we start with Luke? And Bob, would you like to ask a question as well? Yes. Okay, so Luke and then Bob.
Hi, Julie. So firstly, thank you so much for that presentation. Really, really enjoyed it. And you and I have been working, I think, in separate corners of the world, but on very similar questions. So I'm going to ask you 2 of the tougher ones that get asked me, and then I will shamelessly steal your answers, if that's okay with you. So the first question I have is in relation to the analytic separation of disability and impairment in your explanation. So you use them as different terms, and you clearly see there being both strategically and analytically an importance in keeping a separation between them. I suppose if we were coming from the kind of Shelley Tremaine or Tom Shakespeare school of things, the retort would be something along the lines of, well, if disablement is social, but impairment is also social, then what's the use in using 2 terms instead of 1? Doesn't that simply obscure the fundamental relation that you're pointing to? So I'd be really interested. I have my own answers to that, but really interested to hear what yours are. And the second is regarding your skepticism of thick description, which, if I understand you correctly, also extends towards what we might consider to be kind of live world description. You know, those disability studies, often very political disability studies articles that we read, where someone is talking at great length about their own individual life, their aesthetic feelings, their relations to their body, what have you, and then relating these to structuring institutions in the world or structuring attitudes within the world. You point in the argument on impairment in particular to the production of bodies which cannot be integrated into the production, into the labor process, basically into the capitalist form of exploitation. And so I guess reading a little into your analysis are therefore abstracted from those correlations of capitalist society. I guess returning to Marx, we might want to say something like every abstraction is also a form of world making. So in Capital, where you have the kind of socially necessary labor or what have you extracted from concrete labor, abstract labor taken from concrete labor, we notice that a world emerges of kind of subterranean occult style relations, fetishes, aesthetic elements, and what have you. That being the case, would there be an argument to say that there is a place for thick description within an analysis which is grounded in the same tenets that you ground yours in, but that it might act in a different way than maybe the very descriptive grounding texts that we read in disability studies work? Thanks very much.
Sure. So Iona, you're going to take one more question, and then I'll
Yes.
respond to both.
Bob, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I want to stick with this issue of impairment and disability. And ask the question and explain why I'm asking it. In your presentation, you spoke about a British social model. I actually don't know what that is. In fact, I would say it doesn't exist. And the reason is that I think there is an idealist social model and there is a historical materialist social model. Secondly, I think people have not acknowledged that Mike Oliver's social model is based on the pious social interpretation of disability and the thing of John Torrant, Mike Oliver, and myself are all historical materialists. That I don't know where people get this idea that reaching impairment is natural. I never said that, and nor did Vic, and Paul Hunt didn't. So I spoke to Paul before any theory and even empire ever existed. And we always put impairment in the context of the capitalist system. What we did say is that break between impairment and disability is a random myth that it is natural, that impairment is natural, and that it is impairment alone that creates social disadvantage. That is what we've always rejected, is that it's a linear process, that if you're impaired, then you're automatically disadvantaged. That what we argue is that the social relations within capitalism create the oppression, the exclusion, and the marginalization. And writers like Paul Apperly argue that to have a social oppression theory of disability, you do have to look at how capitalism creates impairment. So I think there's a risk of being socially constructed, and I'm not going to give Shakespeare Watson any airtime whatsoever. And finally, I believe in your end of your presentation, you talked about the Marxist Disability Network working on this area. I think my own book is actually a contribution to that, but I do argue and explain why I think there is an issue about why impairment and disability are separate, why we need a social model of impairment to understand how impairment is and what creates it.
Great questions, thank you. So I'm gonna go to first Luke's, and then there's connections obviously between them. Now let's see if I can remember. Luke, you can always remind me. So one of the questions was about thick description. Both of you, I think, were addressing the question of disability and impairment. And if that's right, Luke was saying the relation between them. If their disability is social and impairment is social, then why make a distinction? Could be the counter argument. And this relates, then, you know, Bob is also asking about the relation between impairment and disability and how important it is. And also arguing that the British social model, which he was, you know, was a part of developing, does have an understanding of impairment as social and not natural. I think that, you know, stepping back in terms of the question of disability and impairment and the distinction, as I was working, it goes back to that question of the relation between the natural and the social. If you don't make the and the question of and the question of concepts and the conceptual, and what are concepts for, and what is a concept. So let me get to the concept issue in a second. But disability impairment, if you don't just make a don't distinguish between them, then what you end up saying, I think, if you don't distinguish them, then impairment then you end up saying, you end up in a position that impairment is a social construction, that there aren't bodily differences and there aren't specific kinds of bodily differences that position you in the social division of labor in specific ways. So I'm not, so for me, impairments aren't simply any difference. For instance, you know, we talk about, I think I mentioned before, something that I think about is, well, glasses, right? If you're, you know, my eyesight without glasses, I'm legally blind, but I'm not impaired I'm not visually impaired, you know, because they're corrected, right? So that's not an impairment. I'm not visually impaired. People who are infertile are different. They have physical differences. They're real. So, you know, biological differences, but it's not an impairment. But yeah, so the question, disability versus impairment, is that question of the natural and the social. And then in terms of concepts, and this is, you know, where Shakespeare and Watson really go down this epistemological dead end, and a lot of the people that I'm looking at, the more recent, like actor network theory, some of the new materialists, you know, they go down, many of them, the same dead end. They are taking up I would say a Nietzschean logic, and a good text. I'm not teaching right now, but when I was teaching, I taught a lot of times Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt on the function of concepts, which is anthologized in Selsom, what's his name? Selsom and Martel's Reader of Marxist Philosophy. So the function of concepts there in Engels, which he talks about, concepts are never the same as reality. They are in asymptotic relation. So concept will never be equal to reality. And that's in essence what Shakespeare, on the basis of that idea that they could be, Shakespeare and Watson end up arguing that kind of stunningly contradictory argument that we are all impaired, because they were very insistent on the importance of impairment and difference in the beginning. Abrams and Gibson are some of the writers that I critique in my chapter, who are much more recent as actor network theory, and they almost word for word make the same, well, in spots word for word. I mean, their language is very different, because they're coming out of actor network theory. It's got lots of layers and sophistication, but when they come to their critique of the social model of disability, what they say here, this is a quote: the dichotomy of body versus environment, and then that's what they call it, the dichotomy of body versus environment. And then they say that it fails to grasp the fluidity, and basically they're saying the fluidity of actually existing networks. So that completely negates the concepts and the difference between concepts and reality. And on the basis of that, again, interestingly, very, different rhetoric in a lot of ways, but towards the end of that article, what they end up saying is that this is I think a quote: accepting that difference is a default human condition. So they go from this insistence on the ever so shaded difference to human condition. So it's that flip side. So that's the epistemological dead end, and obviously that has a lot of comes out of the large post-structuralism, postmodernism, and that has that Nietzschean logic to it. So that is the answer. And to Bob, and I'll just, as long as I'm on that, to Bob, I can understand, I can hear your frustration, and I can understand it, because, someone like, me comes along, and I'm looking at part of, and I'm really, really glad that you asked this question, that Luke asked the question, and that people are doing this work, and it will be very helpful to me, because what I was looking at in particular was that the fundamental principles, and what I'm seeing, like in the the Finkelstein article that we read, he would, on the one hand, very strongly argue for the social relations of production, exploitation as the root cause, and then later in that same text, he would argue a political theory that dropped out the social relations of production and was focused on institutions severed from. So then he ends up with this eclectic approach, which in the context, particularly that we're living in, is opens the door for, well, that eclecticism ends up being pragmatic, and it's sometimes in the name of activism and in the name of getting something done, but it's very problematic, and I think in the end it's not going to get done what you really want to get done, and you have compromised the ability to produce the revolutionary theory, which is really the answer in the end. Thick description. Okay, so that I've said a lot, and I want other people to be able to talk and ask questions, but just before I leave that, the thick description, again, really a good question, Luke, and the experiential. There are some really interesting texts which cross genres and provide autobiographies from a materialist perspective. I mean, I have even a thought, that's something I would like to do at some point, but there's so much theoretical work to be done right now. There's not time. So the issue of thick description, as I'm critiquing it, is really comes down to delinking from the social relations of production. It's that these theories, these dominant theories and writings that we've all seen so much of are only the mediations, and they're only the cultural and the political in many layers. So it can look very complex, but it's actually simple. It's reductive in the non-scientific sense because it leaves out that crucial layer. So I would agree with you. It's not an issue of genre, and it's not an issue of topic. It's the issue of, do we delink that?
Beautiful responses. Thank you very much, Julie. Ariana, would you like to ask a question or more?
Yes, thank you so much, Julie. That was just amazing. Thanks so much. I think I have two questions, but please just choose what to answer. I'll be short. So I think the first one is thinking about impairment as historical and social made me wonder about the kind of collective political response we can build on that basis, especially thinking of the ones that we worked with, starting from disability as social and historical. So all the organizing around barriers, around access and so on and so forth. I was wondering whether with adding this conception of impairment as itself social and historical, what kind of work might we explore? Would it be connected, similar, or to the one that we engage in, starting from disability? Or do you think there are specificities that can issue from your from that enhancement, use a better term, of that theory, just through your new perspective? And the second, again, please feel free to not to answer the second part. I was just wondering about the term, and sorry, I won't go to the different points, but so very generally, it was really helpful to, it seemed to me that you used, you mentioned as a political subject that you return to, the idea of disabled workers, and it's not just, I think, and from, it has a very complex subject, which is not just a shorthand for disabled people under capitalism. You are really identifying specific processes that build, that create, that produce this subject. So my question is, if you could say more about, how you see these political subjects as whether who you are referring to, whether we should encounter it as a subject that can be expanded beyond the workplace, for example. So are you talking about the whole of the working class under capitalism once impairment and disability are produced? Or is yes, I was wondering if you could say more, because it was very fascinating how you were using it, of course, within it's no surprise, in a very precise manner. So and feel free not to answer one of the questions or whatever. Thanks so much again.
Yes, thank you. What kind of work? Actually, Ariane, I wanted you to ask. I'm not see if I could clarify. By what kind of work do you mean? Do you mean in particular political work, activism, or theoretical work, or both?
Sorry, I messed up with the, whatever any kind of work, whether the level of theory, organizing, I don't see one as more important than the other. So I was just curious about, whether theory or practice or both.
Yeah. I don't think that in terms of work, I mean, I'm thinking about, for instance, Marx's ruthless criticism of everything that exists. I don't know if I have the, different translations that which issues we talk about, for instance, or in that sense, the work to be done, is going to be partly based on what are the urgent issues of the day. Is the work going to be different? In terms of the theorizing, I think, for instance, the approach to the work is probably the most fundamental that I am trying to and arguing for producing critique from the historical materialist perspective, and that in terms of other kinds of work, organizing, etc., that it's the question of what is the theory and what is the mode of analysis through which we do that, and that will be so essential. And then that's regard, I think, what think of in that fundamentals principles that I referred to. What's really strong about that essay is their argument about on what basis we proceed with trying to, for instance, they were saying we're interested in incomes. Of course, we're interested in developing incomes, but not as an in itself, not separate from other issues. That was the critique that they made of the alliance during that, and that we have to understand the cause in order to be able to intervene in the effects. To me, part of the question, and again, I think their effectiveness is the issue of priorities because of the limited resources. So as an individual or as a group, you have to really think about what your priorities are. As I was saying to Luke, at one point, I thought I was going to write a cross-genre sort of autobiographical / theoretical piece. And I don't, maybe I'll do that someday, but right now there's so much theoretical work to be done. And that's what I'm in a position to do. So it's really important that I do that. I think the theoretical work, and this is where I thought that Roddy Slorok's presentation was really amazing. His book has been important for me to read. But the one thing I noticed that I disagree with him about is he said something toward the end about something to the effect of like movements wax and wane, and I don't think what we do matters that much. Yes, movements wax and wane, and they depend on a lot of things. And like right now, there's more struggles happening because of the economic circumstances and the crisis and so on. But in order to have, I do agree with Lenin on this point, in order to have a revolutionary movement, you need revolutionary theory. So what that revolutionary theory is needed in order to enable developing those struggles in a more productive way. So I don't know, that's a kind of a little abstract, vague question, but it's just a question. I think it's so much of like, it's what are our priorities going to be and how are we going to approach it? And I really think that I think that the issue of the mode of analysis is really crucial. In terms of impairment, in terms of the pandemic and impairment, it's really, again, crucial that we start in a really dialectical way and not assume in any way disabled people or people with even the concept of pre-existing condition tends to imply that those people who have diabetes and heart disease and obesity and all these things, take obesity in the United States is an enormous problem. and the people who were obese were very vulnerable to COVID-19 and severe impacts. But that obesity is not in itself, that has been produced, and again, in complex ways, but because food is not produced for use, it's produced for exchange, and its ultimate purpose for capitalists of producing food is to make a profit, not to meet people's needs. So it's that issue of needing to be really careful not to take as a given, for instance, obese people and people with the slide that I skipped over, the CDC had 21 different categories of medical conditions. So that's a very thick description, and then subcategories, right? So it's very complicated in terms of complex, in terms of the number of conditions, but there's no analysis of why those conditions exist to be in the first place. So, and in terms of the political subject, and maybe others can add on that question, the political subject, disabled workers, yes. I mean, I think certainly the working class as a whole, because of the analysis is important in dealing with production, that really kind of grounds and centers the analysis. But for instance, I was reading somebody's, I think it was Keith Rosenthal, his article, he referred to post-productive and non-productive workers, like in capitalism. Such a large portion of people are now and are becoming disabled, that is an important part of the working class. And it is important to not, in other words, not to have that subject, a working class subject and subjectivity, and a class conscious one, for instance, that doesn't stay with the market, because then if you are interpolated as a subject of the market, you're interpreted as an individual who's in competition with other people. And that's one of the ways in which you see the production of the false consciousness of the able-disabled split, as if and the argument from my perspective is that those two groups, able and disabled workers, have the same fundamental interests in transformation of the social relations of production, and that there's all kinds of ideologies out there, including being produced by the left, that interpolate subjects as subjects of the market, and therefore the market delinked from production and exploitation. And from that perspective, you're always going to be dividing and conquering the working class, whether they're working class people who are currently working, or working class people that are not able to work because they're disabled, or working class people that are at the moment the reserve army of labor. And of course, people are moving as individuals, people are moving in and out of those all the time. So does that answer your question? And do you want to follow up? And does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Thanks so much. That was great.
Thank you. I think I'm the next one with a few questions. So I share your critique of the new approaches to disability that try to distance themselves from the social model of disability. And I just had a few questions. So social modelists such as Finkelstein and Oliver and others have said often, because they've been criticized for either not being theoretical enough, or for having a particular theory that others disagree with, and so on. And they've often said that actually the social model is not a theory. It's a model, it's a practical and a pragmatic, and you mentioned pragmatism, a pragmatic tool for disabled people to use in order to address the kind of immediate barriers in their social lives. So I just wanted to, I just wondered, how does that factor in? Because I've seen that you've said that the social model is a theory. So how would you respond perhaps to someone who would like me would bring this up. So that's my first question. Should I go to the others? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm trying to read my own writing, which is not very legible. Oh yes, and then there would be, so you've mentioned disability and impairment as being the main distinction that is of course worth still using, and there would be people who are so neurodivergent people and people who experience mental distress, and others who may who say that neurodivergence is not an impairment, mental distress is not an impairment, because impairment to them means something that is a physical manifestation of one's body. How would you respond to someone who might say your theory does not include or does not address the concerns of people with mental distress or the matters of mental distress, for instance? And then finally, I was just wondering if for the social theory of disability and the pandemic that you mentioned at the end of the presentation, which schools of thought or whose work would you recommend that we engage with? Who can provide us with the tools that may help us to understand the pandemic and its relationship to capitalism and disability? Thank you.
Okay, great questions. Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, I have seen where they social model, the theorists of the British social model say that it's not a theory. And then there's a question of what is a theory? Because a theory, on the one hand, you can understand theory as any mode of intelligibility. And in that sense, it's a mode of intelligibility. Or you can understand theory in a more focused, limited, you could say, or focused way, which is something that explains and claims to explain. And in that sense, they do argue for explaining that the necessity of theory of explanation, in which case I'm not sure it's problematic, I would say. It may be where that vacillation came from in part, that we think we need to explain why there's disability, but we're not putting forward a theory. It's a little bit of a problematic argument per se. At the same time, I think it's very just dialectically speaking, again, historically speaking, that there and there's a reason why when I went to cut out, which I had more slides, right, and I have more, and that there was a reason why I ended up cutting out Shakespeare. It's not as important at the end. It's like there's certain I mean, it's important as the genealogy from Shakespeare to Shakespeare and Watson and their epistemological critique to the ANT and the new materialism, and that genealogy. Critiquing those theories is important in part because it helps us understand the contradictions and as they developed. And as they are developed, there's a reason why actor network theory became and ontological theories became important. And as we critique those, for instance, it's understanding of nature, understanding nature and having something to say about nature has become increasingly important with climate change, right? So they're responding to real important problems and issues. The way they respond is not, I think, in actor network theory, and I argue, effective. It is definitely a version of thick description, the versions of actor network theory. So in terms of theory, what they have to say, that I think is somewhat contradictory, because on the one hand, it is a theory in terms of a mode of intelligibility, but if you think of theory as something that explains, they're claiming to explain. So it's a little bit hedging in that respect, maybe. I have to think about that. In terms of that question, somebody could argue, what about neurodivergence? Your theory doesn't include that. And then you mentioned mental distress. I mean, part of the issue is, and when you take the individual groups, part of the issue is it's historical and historically changing. So, if you get too into the each individual, it because it's moving and changing, it could be easy to you can get a little bit what Engels says, if you get too caught up in the individual, it can be difficult. I'm not saying that very well. Let me think but I just want to step back and say, in terms of mental distress, for instance, I think what used to be called mental illness, maybe, that is increasingly a large portion of people who are impaired and disabled in capitalism in the United States and beyond. And part of it is, in terms of neurodivergent, if you want to argue, well, that's a positive, it's a difference, but it's not an impairment. I think my answer would be, that's not an option in capitalism that we're given, in our society that we're given. There really is not the option of having a difference. Well, no, I mean, there are differences, like I was saying, that don't constitute impairments. But neurodivergence, depending on what the neurodivergence is and what the context is, over Zoom, for instance, one of the things people talk about in the pandemic, for instance, there is some fluidity in terms of groups and individuals. If you are on Zoom and you don't have to have your picture, not making eye contact doesn't matter, right? So but in I would say, autism spectrum disorder, I think that this theory, Marxist theory and critique, can still understand and address those issues. And I wouldn't agree, they might say, I don't want to be part of your theory, and that's your choice, or they don't agree with that theory. They part of that, where that's coming from, is someone might not agree with my theory, or they might have a critique of it, which is fine. I still think it can explain that. It can even explain why there's this fuzziness there, because it's a point of historical development and change. But I don't think that negates the theory. And again, the Engels function of concepts, I think, is really helpful there. I don't remember the other question.
The other question was basically, whose work should we engage with and read to create the theory of pandemic? And
there are a lot of really descriptive theories out there. I am one of the editors, the World Socialist Workers, whatever, WSWS is a popular theory. And I thought, when I looked at that recently, and I'll have to look at it again, their web text has an interesting article, some interesting articles on the pandemic. They argue against mitigation, for instance. They're arguing for an end to COVID-19 and not just mitigation. That was interesting. So for a popular, I'm one of the editors of the Red Critique, which is online, and issue number 16 had we had an open issue where we didn't put it out at one time. When somebody had something written, they published it. So there are, I think, 5. So I think, for instance, Rob Wilkie's article, so it's the Red Critique, it's free, it's online, and it was issue 16. So the recent one, it's the one before the recent one. I thought Rob Wilkie's, it's a short text, is useful. Stephen Tamino, who's editing the book that I have a chapter in, he has 2 articles there. I have one on, it's called the Hunger of Vibrant Matter. It's on hunger in the pandemic. And then, of course, this book, I mean, part is that I'm, my chapter is in, I think will be useful, but it's not out yet. So there's Darth, if you come across things, I would be interested to know, because there's not a lot from what I'm seeing.
Thank you. I'm just curious. Do you know when the book will be published? Is
I
the date
think,
known?
I'm not sure exactly, but it'll be 2025. It's not going to be 2024. It's still in revisions. And also, as you know, right now, there are lots of obstacles. So where the different contributors are in terms of, people have had various issues. So there's some of the contributors are a little bit, it's going to take a little longer, as these things do. Mine is, I think, closer to being done than some of them for various reasons. So that hopefully, 2025, whether beginning, middle, I'm not sure. I also wanted to mention, can you remind me the pronunciation of your name, because I'm not sure I get it right.
Joanna?
Joanna, if I said that right. The last time we met, and one of the theories I critique is, and will be critiqued in that book, is social reproduction theory. And the fourth chapter, the last chapter of my book, you might be interested to read on in that, because that book was published in 2012. It doesn't say much about social reproduction theory. So there's that book, which talks about the domestic labor debates, and then some of the other work on social reproduction that was done after that. And then I would really highly recommend on that question, Martha Jimenez's book. It's GIM, and I have a review essay. It's something between an essay and a review in the recent issue of the Red Critique 17. So you might want to look at and I don't usually, get too involved in promoting my own work, but that on that particular question, the last chapter, that book is based on my dissertation. So I think that chapter is useful. Some of the chapters I have to go through so many layers of post-structuralism, postmodern theory, because it was my dissertation, that I don't find them as useful now. But
Thank you very much. I believe Ariana Introna has written a review of one of Marta Jimenez's books. So just thought I'd mention that. Ariana, if you wish to share your link in the chat, please do. I'm conscious of the time, and it's almost 8 p.m. Thank you so much, Julie, for joining us today and presenting your chapter. When the book is out, please do send an email to the mailing list to let everyone know. We will be taking a 2-month break with the presentations, so we will be back and refreshed, hopefully, in September with a new series of talks, with the rest of the talks for the year. We will also be putting out an announcement, I believe, in September or October, inviting those who are interested to present in the future, to put themselves forward. And I believe this is it in terms of updates from us. Thank you very much for attending. We will be uploading this, the video recording of this session later on YouTube. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and we'll see you back in September.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Julie.